Hello, everybody. A very happy Sunday to you all. It is a pleasure to be joining you again in this freezing weather. Lots of snow in the country today, which is a very timely backdrop for today's topic because we are talking about the Romanovs, or the Romanovs, and the October Revolution. So a really juicy subject, rich, glittering imperial dynasty, brought to ruins with violent revolutionary overthrow, subterfuge, betrayal, lost treasure. We've got the palaces, princesses, and, of course, proletariat discontent. So, what do we make of the history? How does it affect us? Why should we care here in England? And with whom in this story do we sympathize? And I'd really like to do a balanced account today. I can see in the chat already we've got both our trad monarchists, but we've also got our staunch revolutionaries. So this is not going to be I'm going to try to keep my my fetishization of the imperial dynasty under control and be as fair as we can. And to answer all of these questions, I am, of course, joined by resident historian History Bro, who has an excellent channel, so please subscribe, and has recently finished a really brilliant series on Stalin. So hello, History Bro.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's very nice to chat with you. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Yeah, no, I'm fine, thanks. Just looking forward to this, having a bit of a chat about the Romanovs, or Romanovs, however you want to pronounce it.
Romanovs. Well, I've listened to a few documentaries this week, and that is how they tend to say it, but I feel like it's just too pretentious, really.
Well, I've always said
just in case there are any Russians, Yeah, me too. I wasn't sure if I get picked up by any Russians listening, but there we go. So I was trying to think how you and I actually got talking about the Romanovs, but I think we maybe just agreed it was a shared interest. Was that right?
Yeah, I think just at the end of one of the last times we spoke, I just said, what do you want to talk about next? And I think you just mentioned it. I'm not sure why, but it is such a great topic, so massive. There's so much there, so many different interesting, fascinating events and figures that, there's so much to talk about. So, if we've only got a couple of hours, we have to sort of pick and choose a bit because I could drone on about it for forever, really.
Oh, that's fantastic, though. Because, I did have a few people, after I put up the advert yesterday, say, well, what does this have to do with British nationalism? Which is a fair question. But, it seems, I always find it fascinating that they've managed to maintain this, you probably could call it almost a commercial reputation and kind of affection on the popular public consciousness, at least. I know there are a great many films. It's a real industry, the Romanov industry. So, I'd be quite interested to, despite the kind of gargantuan terrain of this subject, I feel like there's still a bit of an enigma in many ways. And I'm never sure whether I know the Romanovs as the brand or, it'd be really nice to get a more detailed, nuanced, as they say, understanding of the context and what to make of it today, which is why, of course, you are the right person to bring on.
Thanks.
So why don't we start? Obviously, despite over a century on now, they've managed to hold on a great deal in the popular culture. They've managed to maintain their reputation, and ironically seems to get actually stronger and more nostalgic the more the years go on. So should we start at who they were? Obviously, this is the last of the Tsars, the family themselves. Is that a good place to start?
Yeah, I think that thing you're talking about there, that this sort of rose-tinted view of this sort of poor family. It's sort of hard to avoid that. They are sort of a tragic figure collectively, or Tsar Nicholas II is really a tragic figure in so many ways. So I think that's what that is. And there's also this idea of sort of a golden age, the pre-World War I world, that was sort of a golden age before this catastrophe of World War I, which leads more or less directly, historians think, more or less directly into World War II and the Cold War, and just really the terrible tidal wave of endless events that was the 20th century. People look back at that, and it's hard to not see the pre-1914 world as some sort of rosy golden age in some ways. Of course, it wasn't on the ground for a lot of people, obviously. but it's easy, really easy, too easy, really, to look back at it like that. And so, of course, the Romanovs and Tsar Nicholas and his life, examples par excellence of that. The way they lived in just really kind of insane opulence, and the juxtaposition of that with sort of the terrible conditions of untold millions of Russians. It's just everything dialed up to 11 there, all wrapped up in the story of the Romanovs. So I think that's why it's a lot of people look back sort of the armchair level of history and look back at them with some sort of nostalgia, perhaps not really taking into account sort of the nature of monarchy and autocracy and how that is, terribly unfair, whichever way you look at it. But if we dive into the details of it, we'll get into it. I mean, they did suffer. So
are there comparisons to be made between? Is it similar at all to the kind of Louis XIII, Marie Antoinette type opulence situation? Is that a helpful way to think of it, or?
Yeah, in some ways, of course, those parallels aren't brilliant, but in many ways, yeah, they were sort of closeted in their many palaces and protected, guarded from the realities in a great many ways. And it was sort of by design, though. It's sort of deliberate. It had been that way in the Russian court for hundreds of years, since the days of Peter the Great. The monarchs and the royal family and the court were kept, as I say, sort of closeted in their palaces, and sort of, deliberately kept away from the nastiness. So yeah, it's not really entirely their fault in some ways.
Interesting. So how long before? Obviously, when I think of the revolution, I'm thinking 1917. But am I right in thinking it's actually a series of smaller revolutions as well that both precede and follow that as well? Is it more of a period?
Well, so there's sort of three grand revolutions in Tsar Nicholas's life. There's the one in 1904, 1905, and then there's two in the year 1917. I don't know where to pitch this, but if I just pitch it at people who don't know anything about it, there's the February Revolution in Russia, which sees the toppling of the Tsarist regime and Tsar Nicholas having to abdicate. But it's not until October of 1917 that the Bolsheviks get in, and that's when they storm the Winter Palace. That's in October. So there's two revolutions in 1917, two different ones. And so it's a really quite complicated, messy period of Russian history. There's a couple of different provisional governments led largely by a guy called Kerensky. You might have heard of the Kerensky government or the Kerensky offensive. But of course, World War I is in the backdrop. It's a really, really complicated thing, and that's without throwing in stuff like Rasputin. Yeah, there's a lot there, but the main revolutions, I mean, Tsar Nicholas ruled for... sorry, go on.
No, you go on. Crack on, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, Tsar Nicholas ruled for quite a long time. He became Tsar relatively young. I think he was about 26. He doesn't die until he's about 50. So he rules for a fairly long time. And that whole time, it's shaky as hell. I mean, his grandfather was blown to bits by revolutionaries when he was a 12-year-old. So his whole life, his dad was in a train. When his father was Tsar, when he was about 20-odd. It was in a train that was blown up and derailed, and loads of people killed. And so, yeah, his whole life, his whole reign was a shaky one, really at war with various revolutionary factions within Russia. The events of October 1917 are really a culmination of, generations, really, of unrest. So, yeah.
And are all of those former revolutionary uprisings communist in nature, or maybe what you call Bolshevik in nature, or was that more the latter?
Yeah, no. The Bolsheviks really sort of come in at the end. I mean, they've been around for a long time. But no. So the Bolsheviks didn't really have much to do with the February Revolution, really. I mean. So it's a really complicated picture. I did this for A-level and the Russian Civil War, because right after the Bolsheviks get in and get themselves out of World War I, there's just a civil war that lasts until 1922. So I did this at A-level, but which is quite quite a few years ago now, I must admit. But the details of all the different socialist factions it's really complicated, and the Bolsheviks are just one of these different factions. They're the one that happens to become the supreme winners of this great game. But there's loads. There's the Mensheviks. There's a whole group that get collectively called the SRs, which is just like the social revolutionaries, which is itself an amalgam of all different types of parties. And then there's branches off of that just call themselves the left socialist revolutionaries. And there's just how leftist politics goes. There's just sort of endless smaller factions. And the Bolsheviks are sort of a powerful, established, and within that realm respected one of these many factions. So that's sort of what the picture is.
I see.
Yeah.
And how far back does the Romanov dynasty stretch? Because obviously I tend to think of them as just the single family, but really they're part of a long dynasty of Tsars. Is that right? And these happen to be the last installment.
Yeah. I mean, the Romanov family is august, really. They start in the early 1600s, sort of 1620 or something like that. Tsar Michael I, I think, is their first one. And they've got just a long line of really, really great and ignominious Tsars. There's some really big names in there, like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. And there's some ones that are sort of mad. There was one called Paul, Catherine the Great's son. Paul, Tsar Paul I. It doesn't sound right, does it? Paul isn't really it doesn't sound right. But he was mad, basically. Ended up getting his head caved in with a golden snuff box.
Really?
just as an example of all the different stories. There was one.
Wow.
The official story was that he died of a stroke, and insiders were supposed to have joked that it was the stroke of a golden snuff box. Like to the dome.
Wow, is the snuff box in a museum somewhere, or is this long lost to history? I suppose.
I don't know exactly.
What a way to
go! Had
Had
quite a few queens, quite a few princesses that sort of usurped power and had like really massive personalities of their own, and loads of court intrigue and court coups and behind the scenes love affairs and all sorts of fantastic stories. The Romanov line for sort of 300 years worth is just packed full of brilliant stories. Peter the Great would sort of executed people personally and things like that, or brought the pickled head of his wife's lover to her personally.
Wow.
Things like that, there's just loads of stories. So
that sounds awesome.
But by the time of Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar, the world's a bit of a different place by that point, and he's a very sort of staid gentleman, really. Nicholas II. He's sort of a really polite. He's way too nice.
He seems very mild-mannered. He does seem very mild-mannered, which sounds ridiculous as a Tsar, but that is something I've heard a few times. Kind of a gentle temperament. Although I don't know whether that necessarily translates as benevolent or good to the people. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into it, I suppose, in a bit of detail. But he didn't have like the correct personality traits, it seems. I mean, other people can decide when I tell you sort of the details and things. You can make up your own mind. But it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that he wasn't sort of hard-nosed enough. You needed someone who could sort of wield authority at least, or at least delegate most of the work of government to people that could. But if you get a really, really weak individual at the pinnacle of power, it can be a real problem. But one of the things I wanted to say, actually, that I hinted at, if we're going to talk about Nicholas and the end of the Romanov family and the rise of the Bolsheviks, was something that, I mean, I do this in a lot of my videos, and sometimes I get criticism in the comments about straying into the realm of psychology when I talk about some of these figures' early lives and things that might have happened in their childhood that might sort of be pivotal to the character of the adult that we're going to look at in detail. And I think there's one you can't really avoid.
Yes, that is something I mentioned to you, isn't it?
What's that? Sorry.
The kind of early life I think we talked about that briefly before it came on. I wondered if you could tackle that one for us.
Well, there is one specific event which, he saw his grandfather murdered when he was about 12.
Right. Okay.
So if you can imagine, it's difficult to imagine because this certainly isn't my experience, but if you could imagine being born into a great family, like a very, very rich, very, very powerful royal family, can you imagine being born into that? And not only that, you're not just a member of it, you're not just a peripheral member, but you're in the direct line. And you grow up, in your earliest memories when you're sort of a 5-6 year old or something, the earliest things you're told is granddad is the king. Your granddad is the Tsar, he's the ruler, he's the emperor, and your dad will be emperor after that, and after that it will be you. I mean, imagine being told that when you're a little kid, you're 7, 8 or whatever, and that you've got to have that to sink in. So that's a difficult
There's just no way of
thing.
conceptualizing that.
A bit. But then when you're 12 and still, that's young, isn't it? You're still a child at 12. You're still in your formative years. And granddad gets blown to bits. One day, just one day, in the palace, a bunch of soldiers bring in this half-destroyed body that's got only one leg, or no legs, really. One of the legs is certainly completely blown off. The other one is just tatters. And the rest of this torso is all burnt with innumerable blast marks and small wounds all over his face. And it's your granddad, the Tsar, has been blown up, and he's not dead. His guts are hanging out and stuff. It's terrible. It's the most gruesome thing. But he's not dead. He doesn't die for like another hour. And you're there, you see it, and you're 12. And so that happened to him. And so you can only imagine that left an indelible mark on his psyche in some ways. Well, yeah, I mean, got anything to mention about that?
I don't know if this is an ignorant thing for me to say, but for me, it feels that Russia at this time was such a brutal landscape, and I kind of just imagine that regular violence and war and kind of general sort of low level civil war seems to be constant in Russia. And I suppose it makes sense maybe at 12 years old, but I also wonder. He must have seen so much of that in his life as well. Kind of feels like part of the landscape, kind of regular violence.
Yeah, another little footnote to say perhaps about that is that the team of assassins that did that, I think they were called the People's Will. That was their name, and they were socialists, leftists, revolutionaries. And it was actually a suicide. There was 2 different guys with bombs. One tried to blow up the carriage that the Tsar was in, and it sort of failed. And the second guy did an actual sort of suicide attack, blew himself up, ran up to the Tsar until they were right next to each other, and then blew both of them up. But one of the guys they arrested who didn't die at the scene, who was a member of the People's Will, which they caught him and arrested him, put him on trial, he was found guilty and then hung, was actually Lenin's older brother. Now, of course, we all know, don't we, that Lenin goes on to, depose the Tsarist regime and, issues the orders. We can only imagine, or we're pretty sure, we don't actually have them, but, issues the orders to have them all killed in the end.
Yes.
And so, you can see some sort of grand revenge story playing out there. That Lenin, the young Lenin, he was only sort of a schoolboy or sort of in his late teens or something like that when this happened, when his older brother, the revolutionary older brother who he idolized, was hung by the Tsar, in his mind, by the Tsarist regime anyway. And he eventually, all those years later, gets his own back, and it's sort of, things come full circle in a sense.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. I didn't actually know that, I'll be honest. What period then does Lenin come in? I mean, is he at the forefront? You said it was led by Kerensky, but is Lenin at the forefront of the Bolshevik revolution as well, or is he sort of slightly?
Yeah.
Does he take on the provisional government after?
So maybe just talk about sort of the chronology of events a bit, because it is a bit messy. But Lenin is the undisputed, by 1917, or long before, by the turn of the 20th century, Lenin is the absolute undisputed leader of the Bolshevik faction. So the Menshevik, as I said before, there's lots and lots of different leftist and socialist factions in Russia, in the Russian Empire. and two of the main ones are the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And at different stages, they worked together and hated each other and went to war with each other. And it's a long, complicated story. Mm-hmm. But there's no dispute that Lenin was always sort of the granddaddy of the Bolsheviks. So, but he's always in exile, or nearly always in exile. And he only goes back to Russia in 1917. But when he does go back in 1917, there's no question that he's the leader of that Bolshevik faction. And as I say, they don't actually seize control until October. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. So at what point is the Tsar and his family exiled? Because I actually had thought that they were murdered first in the Winter Palace, but I hadn't realized it was actually slightly after that in a sort of a much smaller, innocuous location in the suburbs, so to speak. But
it's an extremely remote Siberian cellar in which they finally met their end. I mean, extremely remote. It's like a 4-day train journey into the tundra, into the great taiga, the great endless forests of Siberia, and then another 2-day boat ride into the wilderness. And so they died in a really sort of remote place, extremely remote place. But I suppose that story of, no, they didn't die until I think it's like July 1918. And, he first abdicates in, I think, March 1917. So, there's a lot of over a year or 18 months or nearly period there. So, I mean, you want to go into that story a bit, or sort of the earlier downfall, how they got to the point where he had to abdicate.
Yeah, that would be good. I think it's called Ipatiev House. I've just looked it up, and the ruins are still standing. But as you say, it's a really innocuous sort of remote ruin. But still looks pretty nice compared to
the House of Special Purpose. They called it, which is very ominous, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah, that is. It's like this. There's one of the squares called the Square of the People's Wrath. Very scary sounding. So how do we what's the general discontent then in Russia? Obviously this is culminating towards revolution, but what is the main sort of general problem that the public or the people, so to speak, have with the Tsar? Is it just that it's a kind of proletariat uprising? What's the situation here?
Well, I mean, the problem they had is much older than Tsar Nicholas and his reign. Much older. It's older than Marxism. The problem is, I suppose, ultimately, is the relationship between the people and their rulers. So famously, for quite a long time in Russia, there was serfdom, the system of serfdom, a type of indentured slavery in many ways. The way souls actually belonged to their tenants, their overlords in some ways. And the Russian rulers had struggled with that for generations upon generations before Nicholas II. Like I say, his grandfather was assassinated over the same sorts of issues. And it's interesting, actually, that even his grandfather was sort of the end of a long period of struggling, or one of the many waves, I suppose you might say, or you could look at it, of struggle. And he was a great reformer. Those assassins that blew him up that day had actually blown up one of their greatest supporters in many generations. So all through the Napoleonic period and earlier, different czars had sort of different policies about how strict they would be with the serfs, the question of serfdom. And some czars were very strict and would crack down on it, and others would allow some reforms, and it would sort of ebb and flow a bit. And Tsar Nicholas II's grandfather, the one that got blew up, was one of these czars that allowed a great amount of new reforms and was very lenient. And so it's sort of ironic that he was assassinated in a way. But anyway, a lot of people at the time said he'd sort of let go of the reins and allowed the horses to run free, and that, allowed the forces of revolution to have too much free rein. But so anyway, by the time Nicholas himself becomes Tsar, because his father only reigns for, I don't know, about 12 years or 13 years or something, not too long, He sort of died suddenly when he wasn't too old. So Nicholas inherits really quite an unstable political situation by the time he even ascends to become Tsar.
So he had quite a legacy to contend with then.
He was given a difficult hand, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about he gets at the very end of the 19th century, and it's in 1904 that a war sparks off with Japan, and Russia, the Imperial Russian Empire, is expected to win that. The Japanese are the underdogs, even though they've got a sort of a modern navy. They're just not on the same scale in all sorts of ways in terms of industry and economy and population, and they're upstarts in many ways. But they the Japanese, well, essentially in a nutshell, they launch a preemptive attack against the Russian fleet, defeat it, and then when the Russians turn up with another fleet to humble them, that gets defeated. There's a battle of Tsushima, I think it is. Or Tsushima, I think it is, where the Russians are sort of they're unexpectedly beaten, and have to sign a sort of a fairly humiliating treaty. And well, anyway, there's a revolution that happens across Russia at that exact time, and it comes very close. The revolution of 1905, it comes very, very, very close to toppling the whole regime. As I said in my Stalin video, might be repeating some of the things in this that I said in that, but the events that happened in 1917 or something like it very nearly could have happened in 1905. The Tsar being forced to abdicate and some sort of civilian, provisional government come in, and then God knows who knows what after that. But that very nearly happened in 1905. It was only really by the skin of their teeth that they were able to crack down and keep going, at least for a while.
Yeah. So is the Romanovs kind of legacy as being obviously they're very much in the public eye? Are they remotely popular with the general public, or is it sort of divided
at the time? Well, that's a difficult question to say.
There's so much footage of them. It seems the eyes of the world were on them.
Yeah, it's difficult to say because there's so many layers of it's difficult to say. But I suppose one thing I would point to, if I'm trying really sort of desperately trying to be even-handed, is when you did have the Civil War after 1917. As I say, there was a civil war for a few years, and there was a pro-monarchist faction, a pro-monarchist army. Just big chunks of the army and the people, sort of the white faction, or sometimes they were called the Octoberists. There was another faction called the Octoberists, the sort of imperialists, pro-monarchist types.
Yes.
And they, fought on for many years without any leadership from an actual royal family. So I think you could point to that and say that they couldn't have been completely despised by everyone. If you want to, some people might want to try and paint the picture that they were completely despised by everyone. They were just sort of these Marie Antoinette figures in their palaces, and that everyone despised them. Well, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that can be the case. That they would have had lots and lots of vested people. There would have been lots of people with vested interests that would have supported them or liked them for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's a huge country, the huge population. When you're talking about a few 100 million people or something in that ballpark, anyway, you're going to have people at every end of every spectrum. I mean, just the real reality of history when you delve into it. It's just a complex mixture of things.
Well, I suppose the reason I ask is because I was curious. Obviously, it seems obvious to me that for the Bolshevik Revolution to have taken place and been successful in its aim, there must have been quite a substantial momentum behind it. And you mentioned the white. I think he said, was it the White Army and the Red Army? The sort of these two warring factions. I wasn't sure to what extent was this given a great deal of popular support, or was it just as you might say, like a just a complete takeover by the Bolsheviks and a minority of very powerful peoples? I wasn't sure.
Well, what are you talking about there exactly? Because sort of the Red Army versus the White Army with the Green Army and all these factions, and that's sort of the Civil War from sort of 1917 to 1922 period. But if we're just going to talk about the revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917 in October, like how much popular support did that have? It seems in the cities anyway, the Bolshevik movement had massive popular support among urban workers, it seems. I mean, let's be completely honest here, put your sort of historian's hat on. It's difficult to trust all the sources because of subsequent history and the Soviet period. A lot of it is tainted and slanted. Can we be confident that the accounts saying that all the workers were unanimously behind the Bolsheviks in the summer and autumn of 1917, can we be confident that that account is accurate? It's difficult. You've got to be skeptical. You've got to be honest and serious about it. But nevertheless, it does seem, I think, that they had a popular amount of support in that window of time, at least from, as I say, the more urban working classes, because they put together so many Soviets, so many workers' organizations and workers' committees and different what's the word? Union movements that had just massive memberships. That seems to be a matter of record. So there's a lot going on. One of the things I would characterize Russia in 1917 as is just sort of a maelstrom, a big storm of different things going off at once. And it's quite difficult to sort of keep track of it all. But I would say that it
really is. Sorry, I mean, it's. Well, I was just wondering. I mean, I've lost my thought now. Go on, you carry on. I've got so many questions. That's a problem.
Well, just going back briefly to the, if we're going to concentrate more on Nicholas and the Romanovs, going back to that revolution of 1905, you've got like the battleship Potemkin incident, sort of kind of famous. And what he had to do was really give the green light to some quite serious people in his government to crack down and have martial law and shoot into crowds and run down protesters with horses, with sort of mounted Cossacks and things. He gave the green light for some fairly serious things to go down in order to maintain his power. And that was done. When I was researching for the Stalin video, his story sort of concentrates more on things that happened in the Caucasus, in modern places like Georgia and Azerbaijan, places like Baku. And it seems there were just mass killings on the street, just lots and lots of bodies. Nice. So it's quite a serious thing. It's not like protests we have now. It would be a sort of almost running street battles, that sort of level. The protesters would make sort of workers' battle groups and things.
Right.
But so anyway, the Tsarist regime, the Tsarist faction, is ultimately successful though in 1905. But of course, it's rocky to do that. It's a rocky road to just use main force to put down your enemies, isn't it? Because you're going to probably always be forced, unless you utterly annihilate them, you're going to be forced into that situation again at some point in the future, probably. And the Tsar was forced to make lots of concessions as well, to sort of give up his supreme power as an autocrat. I mean, him and his immediate successor, his immediate predecessors, were not really true autocrats, in the sense that their word was law. But at least on paper, they were autocrats. They're a type of king. But he had to sort of give up that power, and there was a Duma, which is a type of parliament, I suppose you could say. The word parliament, our word as we know a parliament, it's not exactly the same as that, but a parliament-like body was set up to sort of help him rule. And so I think it's fair. I've seen historians say, and I totally agree, it's kind of an obvious thing to say, I suppose, but it's fair to say that Nicholas's rule, you can really look at it in two halves. There was the days before that, his rule before he had to give up a lot of his power to this Duma, and the second half, everything after that, because it was sort of a sea change, a gear shift, it's sort of a different thing. And some have said, and when you can step back and look at it from a distance, some have said that the seeds of his destruction were sown then. Without a strong personality, it was always going to be a slippery slope to, not necessarily his death and all his family's murder in a Siberian cellar, but his political doom was sown in sort of 1905, 1906. So I suppose that's an interesting thing to note. And also another say that one of the guys that he had to pick, because he wasn't strong enough to put down all these rebellions and revolts himself, but he picked sort of a strong man, Stolypin his name was, as sort of an interior minister and later a sort of a prime minister, to be a strong man with a strong hand to put down all these rebellions. And in 1911, at a theatre, the royal family, a lot of the princesses were there, and Stolypin, very close to the royal family, was just shot and murdered in front of them by a revolutionary. So the Assassination of Sleep. And again, it's another example of just the reality coming very close to the Romanovs, suddenly, almost out of nowhere, like when Grandad was blown up that day. It's like, just sometimes the brutal reality of what's out there will sort of very suddenly interject into their lives. And, it only sort of gets worse. As I say, it is sort of a slippery slope downwards for them.
Okay, so obviously the little boy, I think his name is Alexei, he's the Tsar's son, and he's destined to be, obviously to continue that lineage. So when the revolution occurs, is the end game immediately to kill the family? Because obviously or is it simply to exile them, and that unfolds later, of course. But was that the intention?
Yeah, sorry, there are two questions there about Alexei the boy and when they would decide to be killed.
I assume that they were after him in particular. So rather than just exile, was there was that always the end game to make sure that the heir was finished off as well?
Yeah, so it depends who you would have asked. So the Bolsheviks had decided long ago, in like 1903 or something, like long before they ever had any realistic chance of being the government of Russia, they had a committee and had a vote and decided that if it was ever up to them, they would kill the entire Romanov family. they were for execution so that was decided as far as Lenin and his party were concerned. But they're not in control of things in February 1917 when the Tsar has to abdicate. There's a provisional government led by, at least mainly in part, by this Kerensky, who is an SR essentially. He's a socialist, but he's not a Bolshevik, so he's nowhere near as hard line. So he's not under any political pressure to sort of just murder them straight away, or anything like that. Whilst the Romanov family are under the control of a Kerensky-led provisional government, they're in a tough spot. They're in a dangerous situation, but they're not immediately going to be executed. So it's only later that when the Bolsheviks get in control that they are executed. It's surprising, actually, to me that they weren't killed quicker, because, as I say, their death doesn't occur until July 1918. And there's a lot of back and forths in the last few weeks and months of their lives. There's a lot of shady backroom goings on, and lots of different factions try and stick their oar in, and it all gets messy. But it is a bit surprising to me that they weren't sort of murdered as soon as Lenin could have done it. But anyway, that's how it plays out.
What would you say to the statement that they got what was coming to them? To put it bluntly.
It's a bit harsh. I would make the distinction between the people that were innocent or not. So, for example, those girls, they're sort of innocent, really. They didn't choose to be in that family, and they never ordered the exploitation of any works. I mean, sure, they took advantage of, you know, wearing pearl earrings and having diamond encrusted everything they wanted, but it's not their fault. I mean, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, I don't have all that much sympathy for, although I do have some. I don't want anyone particularly to be murdered, unless you're, you know, like a real evil character, like a Ted Bundy type serial killer. I don't particularly want anyone to be murdered in a basement. So I think that's a bit harsh to say that they got what they deserve. Especially, I think of them much more as tragic figures. Although I don't think they particularly got what they deserve, but I don't have much sympathy either. Not much, really. Not for Nicholas. I do for the girls and that little boy. I mean, what is he, 13 or 14? Like, he's kind of an innocent
very young
person in this. But yeah, I don't have that much sympathy for Nicholas, because his destiny was in his own hands for decades, and he sort of, in my opinion, and lots of historians I think would agree with this, he led himself to that cellar in many ways. It's a difficult story. He's a difficult figure to get a handle on. He's a complicated figure. There's a lot of people in history, they're relatively straightforward. You know, Genghis Khan, quite a straightforward figure. Stalin, in many ways, is straightforward. What you see is what you get, more or less. And other people have, you know, kind of a more rich inner life, or have, I don't know, more, there's just more sort of emotional depth to them, and they don't make sense always, and they make contradictory decisions, and they seem, well, yeah, he's quite a human figure, and just not really, as we say, not really cut out for the job he was supposed to have been asked to do.
Well, that's an interesting lead to Rasputin, really, because I know that Nicholas's missus, I forget her name, the
Alexandra.
Zarina, Alexandra,
Alex.
That's right. She obviously has a bit of a not necessarily romantic, although I'm not sure, but is quite infatuated with Rasputin and brings him in, and he starts to take on quite an active role. Is that correct? Not necessarily in place of Nicholas, but whilst he's at war, he seems to be interfering, put it that way. What do you make of that?
Yeah, there's definitely reports of that. Rasputin's enemies, there's reports that he tried to interfere in government. So the figure of Rasputin is a great one, you know, a comically weird one. Have you ever seen the film with
it is, isn't it?
Alan Rickman? There's the film. Is it Alan Rickman? Yeah. I think from the 70s or maybe early 80s.
I don't think I have. No.
Yeah, it's good.
No, I don't think I have, actually. I might give that a watch later then, because he is a fascinating, I mean, it's sort of disgusting in many ways, but absolutely fascinating guy. I mean, the number of miles he seems to have walked just out in the tundra on his own. Bonkers.
Yeah, he is fascinating. So I suppose his story is mixed up with that of Alexandra.
Right.
So I think she was quite a credulous person, without being too harsh. I think she was a little bit dumb. She was well, how can I put it?
She's a bit gullible, maybe.
Yeah, gullible, credulous. Yeah, she was. She believed in some strange things. She was. She was heavily religious, but to the point where she believed in miracles and icons and things like this, and sort of holy men and prophecies. Yes. She wasn't actually raised to be Russian Orthodox, but if you ever want to become the queen of Russia, you have to by law convert to Russian Orthodox. And Nicholas and the whole family were really quite spiritual and religious and devout, and so she sort of adopted that, and she was very, very Christian before that anyway. So anyway, she believed heavily in the tradition of Russian Orthodox holy men. Okay, so there's this tradition in Russia that they're able to sort of have various powers of predicting the future, and like the laying on of hands to the healing
Like
hands,
soothsayer type
things
thing,
like this.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So like a soothsayer, is that what you'd call him?
Yeah,
Not necessarily
I suppose that's
prophet,
one
but
word. That's one word, yeah. So anyway, this Grigori Rasputin was supposed to have been just renowned in his remote. I think came from way out Siberia way. I think originally he's quite remote. He was just known in his locality from a child almost to have this sort of this crazy charisma about him, sort of shining bright eyes, bright blue eyes, was it? Or he just had some people have just got kind of a crazy, like a charisma or a personality, a shining light about them, and it's difficult to deny. Like some movie stars or rock stars, I don't know who you might say it about, but he seems to have had something about him where people would sort of just fall into his sway. He just had a great sort of gift of the gab as well. Some people are, I don't know, they're just magnetic. And those people also
which
a
is
bit like a
unusual
marmite,
because you
aren't
say
they? Some people hate it. They
that's
just see straight through it and it's like disgusting to them. And some people buy it and go along with it all.
he's sort of funny to me because he's so dirty looking and quite frightening looking, really. But he evidently was quite a magnet, especially to get as close as he did to the royal family. And I think she let him babysit the girls and everything. So that's always really remarkable to me because he looks so obviously like a complete chance.
Yeah, no, that was part of his shtick, was to be this sort of big holy man in dirty robes because he'd sort of taken a vow of poverty or something along those lines, although not that, because he's also famously revelled in food and drink and anything else he could get his hands on. But yeah, this sort of shtick of being a holy man, if you hadn't guessed, I don't buy any of it. I think he's like some sort of Russell Brand figure, just a chancer, just saying, doing anything.
He looks like it. He looks like it.
Yeah, just to sort of just riding your luck at all times with this sort of endless, almost just the gift of the gab thing, and enough people will go along with it, and hopefully you sort of catch someone high up that's rich and powerful, and you take it from there. I think that's all it was. And yeah, he was supposed to have been very scandalous, sort of pinching the bum or pinching the leg of the princesses or duchesses at balls and things like that. And there's stories of him sort of exposing himself drunkenly. There's sort of such extreme behaviour, in a royal court, that it was taken with, like a jester. Sometimes in medieval courts, a jester could get away with an extreme act of rudeness in front of the monarch or the king or something, and they could get away with it because they're the jester. They're sort of the designated individual that can do something kind of outrageous, and you're expected just to titter at it rather than have his head chopped off. So Rasputin sort of had that thing going for him as well. One of the things I was reading just the other day is that he didn't actually spend a massive amount of time at court. If you look at sort of just the records, just the sheer fact, it wasn't that he was sort of there constantly. But what you hinted at there, which is probably one of the main things that led to his killing, his assassination, was the accusation that not only was he maybe had a slightly too close relationship with Alexandra, but that he was actually getting involved in government, and that really wouldn't fly. That's really not cool. Something's got to be done at that point, because after World War I started, and at some point along the line, Nicholas, the Tsar, appoints himself as commander-in-chief in the field of the Russian armies and goes off to the front. And he leaves his wife, his sort of kind of hated wife, back in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, the capital. It's not Moscow, it's St. Petersburg. He leaves her behind as a type of regent, sort of in control of government in many ways, supposed to be doing the business of government in some ways. And she's kind of obviously a bit inept, just nowhere near up to it. And yeah, there's stories of she sort of lets Rasputin sort of pick senior posts within government, and pick which general gets to go which place and things like that. Quite serious decisions. Now,
am I right in thinking that she thought that he was actually helping, particularly with the little boy, because did he not have a what's the blood disease called where it doesn't clot? That's right, yeah, and she seemed to think, and I do think that some of the records do seem to show, or accounts I should say, that actually he did seem to have this miraculous, quote unquote, recovery, which sort of was a bit of a fuel for her being convinced, regardless of what you make of that.
No, that's
but
totally
that seems
the
to be
thing.
her main concern. So it's amazing how close it got.
Sorry, go on. I interrupted.
Mm-hmm. No, that's it. That was it.
So I think there's a slight lag here, but so that's one of the main angles of Rasputin, which I haven't said about, is that he was supposed to have been able to heal the Tsarevich, the boy Alexei, the heir to the throne. That's sort of the whole reason they would even entertain having this dirty old man in their presence at all, is that Alexandra was convinced he could heal the boy. And so there is something strange there that I can't explain. I really can't. If you do believe the accounts, that they're kind of, they're unbelievable. It's difficult to know exactly what's going on there. The only thing I can really say is, or hope to point to, is the placebo effect. Okay, so hemophilia is a disease where you don't have the right chemicals in your blood to make scabs to clot up, basically. So whenever you're cut, your blood clots up and scabs over. If you can't do that, you could bleed to death. Any cut, you'll just bleed out, right? But with many diseases, there's various degrees of severity, I suppose. And this boy, the boy Alexei, the heir to the throne, had it really quite bad, to the point where if he even got bruised, it's a serious problem, because a bruise is just an internal bleeding, isn't it? That's what a bruise is. You've just sort of bled internally a bit.
Yes, of course.
That's what that is. So even a bruised knee could be really a massive problem, could lead to his death. It would certainly lead to agony for quite a long time, him being bedridden. Now, that's not really any sort of life for a little boy to live. That's sort of...
especially
it's a real disability.
Of course.
Yeah. So it's an actual sort of disability. And they knew even then that it's a hereditary thing passed down through the female line. So she knew, Alexandra knew, that she'd given it to him. It actually came from her grandmother, the Queen Victoria, our Queen Victoria. It came down through that line.
Right.
It's a footnote of history, really. Because this
it's a hell of a condition to have.
Yeah, really bad. And I mean, even when he was a newborn. And the other thing, he had this hemophilia really quite so badly that sometimes he could just bruise out of nowhere as well. So it's already a terrifying condition, and you don't even need to sometimes even knock yourself or have any sort of accident. He could just wake up with like a bruise on his stomach and nothing happened. And yet now he's in sort of a terrible position. And, that would happen sometimes. So he's really delicate. He's this really delicate boy.
It sounds such lunacy that... Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, being the heir, of course, is. I mean, his mother must have had him wrapped up in cotton wool. Is there any account of what Nicholas and what his feeling about Rasputin was?
Yeah, he didn't really like him particularly. He didn't hate his guts, but he didn't particularly like him. I mean, he's like this dirty guy that sort of flirts with his daughters and wife. But yeah, as I was just about to get onto, his apparently miraculous ability to heal Alexei. Where he would, I mean, the accounts are that he could literally stand over him and like say a prayer over him, and the boy would almost immediately say, "Oh, the pain isn't as bad," and you could put that just down to a placebo effect, perhaps. But then the bruising would actually subside. So it's like, what the hell is going on?
Who are these accounts written by, though? Are any of these sort of doctors observing, or are they mostly coming from the Tsarina?
Yeah, exactly that. Well, we've got the letters. Famously, we've got lots of letters back and forth between Alex and Nikki. Lots of those survive, and lots of his letters to other people, to his mum. He wrote lots of letters to his own mum all the time, which I think is an odd pathology for a guy in his 40s to be sort of... Well, anyway, there's lots of letters.
He's got enough to be getting on with.
But yeah, there's from the doctors themselves who had a vested interest, who really, really didn't want Rasputin to be able to have this power, to have this sway over the family. It was in their interest for him to be a fake and a fraud. And they say, no, he did seem to somehow miraculously heal him. Now, I can't explain it. I just don't know. There's one story, actually, where he's really quite bad. He did have a knock. He was getting into a little rowboat or something, going out on a little rowing expedition. Alexei, the heir to the throne, and he sort of fell or stumbled in this rowing boat and bashed his hip or something, or his leg. And anyway, he was bedridden in terrible pain. He thinks he's going to die. Everyone thinks he's going to die. He's in terrible pain, and the doctors can do nothing, and the swelling and bruising just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And Alexei himself is saying the most terrible things, heart-rending things, like, you know, when I die, Mother, can you make sure I have this sort of headstone and stuff? I mean, just heartbreaking. And the doctors can do nothing. And Rasputin is sort of out of favor at that time. There'd been a scandal of some dirty pictures that had apparently arisen of Rasputin. And he was completely out of favor and was living in exile out in Siberia. And they got him on the phone, or they got him on the wire or something. And he said, don't let the doctors touch him. He'll be all right. And I'll be there in 3 days, or something like that. It was a missive to that effect. Don't let him stress too much. Don't let the doctors near him, and I'll be there soon. He's going to be fine. And apparently, miraculously, it worked. His pain started to subside, and he recovered from this episode. This like clearly life-threatening episode. All accounts agree it was life-threatening. And Rasputin seems to have cured it by telephone, by wire. That's how powerful. You could do it from Siberia, even.
I must admit, that is fascinating. Yeah, I'll have to. I'm interested to read more on this, actually.
Well, that particular account I've actually sort of paraphrased from Dan Carlin. Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. I don't want to take complete credit for that, but it is a great story, though. I mean, a really great story. But of course, that did give this Rasputin lots of power. I mean, he's sort of a de facto ruler of Russia in some ways. That was one of the things his enemies leveled against him. One little anecdote was that he went out in the street and sort of pulled his robes up to expose himself and said, "This is what rules Russia," or something like that. You know, just complete irreverence, just absolute drunken, sort of insane irreverence. And so that's going to get the backup. If there's any sort of establishment, any sort of deep state, if you like, to use modern parlance, if there's any sort of deep vested interests of an establishment in Russia, they're going to want this guy dead, right? They want this son of a bitch in the ground, you know. And so he does get to come up.
Really, isn't it? Yeah,
massively. And apparently, even the Russian press at the time did say, you know, did point out that what an embarrassment this is. Sorry, go on.
Well, just as you said, he got his comeuppance. Am I right in thinking that one of the stories that they attempted to poison him at first with several cream cakes, which he scoffed, and nothing. There was no visible impact. Maybe he was a bit sick, but it didn't kill him at first. I mean, they'd lace these. Is that right? Cream cakes with poison.
Yeah. So Rasputin seems to have been bordering on indestructible. Again, we don't know how many of the surviving accounts of people that were actually there on that night, how trustworthy they are. But sort of the popular story is that, they lured him, one of the princes, can't remember which one, there's so many, there's such a huge family, but one of the senior princes and his entourage lure Rasputin to have sort of some sort of midnight soiree where they get him drunk and give him poison food. Yeah, I can't remember what it's poisoned with, arsenic or something even more deadly. And they give him loads of it, and it doesn't seem to do anything. And one of the things Rasputin is supposed to have been able to do, along with all these other sort of powers, to lay on hands and to predict the future and to sort of make people do what he wanted, you know, to have this power over people. One of the things apparently he could do is have just an incredible tolerance for drink and other narcotics. He could just drink and drink and drink and drink, one of those people. And And so when they give him all this poison, it just doesn't really seem to do anything. I think maybe one of the accounts says he was a bit groggy, but he should be dead like 3 times over the amount they give him.
Is there also
sorry, go on.
an account of when they shot him and put him in a did they shoot him, put him in a sack in a river, but there was some sign that maybe he even temporarily survived that before? Is that right?
Yeah, so after they poison him, pardon me, after they poison him and it's not working, I think they just attack him, basically. I actually can't remember in perfect detail, but they basically attack him and smash him over the head and stab him. And I think they might even eventually get out into a courtyard, and I think they even shoot him again, but not in the head or anything. And then, that should be enough to kill him. But then he's not dead. Still, after being shot and stabbed and beaten and poisoned. And so I think eventually someone does go up to him and put a bullet point blank through, like, between his eyes. Which all the serious historians, I think, say he was dead at that point, surely. But what they do is they take the body and they I don't know if they put it in a bag or not, but they throw it in the river, the icy river.
Or in a carpet, I think,
Yes, I think that's it. Yeah, roll like a carpet or something like that, and chuck him in the icy river. And well, some of the story is that when his body is fished out days later, pardon me, whenever it was, when his body was fished out, some say that his lungs were filled with water, suggesting that he drowned rather than the bullet in the head that killed him. But I don't think that's true. As I say, serious historians will say that surely is bullshit. Or some people say his fingernails were, or his fingertips and his fingernails were all bloody, where he'd been scratching on the underside of the ice, where he was still alive in the river. But I think we don't think that's true. That the final bullet at point blank range in the face, come on, man, that certainly would have killed him.
It's a nice bit of folklore, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about let's go back to the Winter Palace, and this is obviously like the kind of iconic imagery of the actual revolution. I think comes from the 1928 film, which is the 10 Days That Shook the World, which is like a sort of reenactment. The Winter Palace, obviously, how long has the Tsar and his family been out of there and exiled, or is presumably they're going in there to catch the rest of the aristocrats?
No, not really. I mean, it's largely symbolic, that Winter Palace. So the Tsar and his family, and like I say, he'd abdicated months ago. That the storming of the Winter Palace is in October 1917. Or just quickly to say about the dates, because the Russians went by a slightly different calendar. They've got an Orthodox calendar. We're on the Gregorian calendar, which is in sort of the Catholic Western tradition, and they're on a slightly. So sometimes you might hear it the November Revolution, or sometimes the February Revolution is called the March Revolution. Anyway, the October Revolution. The Tsar and his family had abdicated months before and weren't in St. Petersburg. They're already miles and miles away, and the Winter Palace itself was largely deserted, despite how it's shown in 10 Days That Shook the World. People that were actually there said that the Winter Palace was only being defended by boys, really, cadets, and that as soon as the Red battalions stormed it, just immediately surrendered, just put their guns down. These were, as I say, sort of cadets. And the Winter Palace, there was sort of no real damage done. I think there was like a few broken windows, literally. I'm not exaggerating. I think that's the extent of the damage that was done to the Winter Palace. So it wasn't like this raging mob that was just pillaging everything and certainly not burning it down or anything like that. But it was just sort of more of a symbolic thing. So the 10 Days That Shook the World was originally, I believe, I might be getting some of this wrong. I really hope I'm not, but if I am, I apologize. It was written by John Reed, I think. I think it's a guy called John Reed, an American sort of left-leaning, sort of socialist, sympathizing American journalist. He wrote the book sort of straight after it happened. He was there.
Yeah, this is a very triumphant,
if I'm getting this right,
triumphant kind of account, isn't it? Yeah. It's not sympathetic, the account at all.
No, but yeah, like I say, there's an element of triumphalism to it, and I think the reality of the storming of the Winter Palace was actually quite low key, or relatively. I mean, it's a revolution. There's loads of stuff going on, sort of nationwide, of which that was just one part. But the later Bolshevik propaganda machine just really loved to play it up. I think that's more what we're dealing with here. Hello.
Yeah, it interests me. There seems to be a great tourist market actually for the Romanovs. I'm not sure how much of that is just, tourism industry, or there's a genuine longing and affection from some parts of the Russian Orthodox kind of, culture that does have a genuine affection for it. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Well, I don't know about that. I'm sort of loath to give an opinion on that in a way, because I just don't know. Like you're raised in a certain tradition. Like I'm raised in the English tradition, really. I sort of can kind of just instinctively know what it might have felt like in some small way to be involved in, say, I don't know, the Lancastrian and Yorkist Civil War. I can sort of put my mind into the minds of those people. But to do that for Russian history, I just don't know. I wouldn't feel confident
It's almost
giving. Sorry?
It's almost impossible, isn't it, really?
Yeah, well, so of course we've got the unspoken thing here is the Soviet experiment. We know in 2020, don't we? We can look back that there's this Soviet experiment from 1917 until Gorbachev and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I suppose you could say, in 1989 or something. So there's this whole thing that we can look at, including obviously the terrible, sort of sickening Stalinist period. So there's some people in Russia that look back on that period, fondly, aren't there? There's some, incredibly. I think Slavoj Zizek is one of those people that I think there's lots of people in Russia, and I don't really want to speak for them. I don't really want to put words into their mouth. I don't really want to say, there's loads of people in Russia that love the Stalinist period. And by the same token, I'm sure there are lots of people in Russia that look back on the Tsarist period fondly and love it and wish it had never been removed. I'm sure there are loads, but I just don't. I just don't know about it in enough detail to confidently say this is how the Russians feel about the Romanovs. It's just not really my place. Do you know what I mean? I hope it's not a cop-out,
of course,
to say that. I just don't know what the sort of where they stand in the popular consciousness. If you took an average sort of Russian boomer, sort of someone who's sort of a boomer generation, and asked them what they felt about the Romanovs, I don't know what sort of the average answer would be. I really don't.
Yeah. The reason I suppose I ask is only because I noticed that so many of the churches that were destroyed at the time have been, gradually being rebuilt, and I've noticed that quite a lot of them do have these various chapels and whatnot that seem to be dedicated to the Romanovs, and but maybe it's just a kind of culture industry. I do notice that people the world over are really fascinated by them. You have all these, you look at Christie's, you get these buyers from Hong Kong and New York, and everyone wants a piece of the Romanovs. And it's hard to always pin down exactly what that is, whether it's like a kind of national longing for glory days, our own version of colonial nostalgia, I don't know, or whether it's because what came after was so bleak and profoundly, the profound suffering was so extreme that maybe it just seems preferable in comparison. It's very difficult to say, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't really, I don't think I've really noticed sort of any sort of revivalist movement for the Romanovs, but you can find people that are interested in anything. I mean, you can get T-shirts with like a print of Mao on it, for example. So
True
I suppose it doesn't really matter how sort of good or righteous or anything you were. There'll be some fanboys out there for almost anything.
Well, so the revolutionary aim, would you say, to any extent, despite the great suffering that came later, to any extent, was that successful in what the Bolsheviks were hoping to, to bring about? Were they partially successful in erasing the kind of serfdom and whatnot at all?
Well, specifically serfdom. Yeah, I mean, okay, so one of the things that sort of famously or cliched, if you ever had to do GCSE history in this or something, or A-level history, was that Lenin offered peace, land, and bread. That was sort of his promise to the people. Let's remember, we're talking 1917, World War One. We've had a few years of the horror of World War One, and from the Russian perspective, they got pretty badly trounced in World War One. Really, kind of humiliated repeatedly in World War One in various ways. They had a set of big offensive, the Brusilov offensives, and basically sort of throughout all of 1915, they were really on an extended set of strategical retreats. There's this thing in sort of war gaming of the idea of exchanging space for time. If you can just retreat without losing too many men again and again and again, whilst you regroup, and it will shorten your lines of logistics and extend your enemies. And in other words, exactly that, you're exchanging space that you retreat into for time in order to get together counteroffensives of your own. And they're doing that for the whole of 1915. I mean, that's kind of terrible, on the tactical, strategical level to be doing it. It's humiliating. And 1916 it isn't much better. And in the end, after the Tsar has to abdicate, he gives this terrible situation to his successors, to the provisional government, mainly led by this guy Kerensky. He hands over this sort of dire, this terrifying situation of World War One that the Russians have got to deal with on their front. So this Kerensky, or the first provisional government, what they decide to do is fight on. I mean, suppose if you just look at it, what your options are fight on, or have some sort of peace, come to some sort of agreement with the Germans or the Austro-Hungarian German alliance. But if you're going to come to some sort of agreement with them, it's going to be a really shit one for you from the Russian point of view, because they know they've got the upper hand. They could walk all the way into St. Petersburg if they want to, really. Some historians have said that. I was listening to someone just the other day saying that at a certain point in 1917, if the German high command had wanted to send divisions to St. Petersburg, they probably could have done it. So the Russians in this whole affair are massively on the back foot, massively the weaker partner. And yet Kerensky decides to fight on, even though the army is more or less disintegrating in the field. And more than that, he's a socialist. He's an SR, basically. He's a leftist revolutionary. So he allows sort of political commissars to go into the army, into the front line, and sort of sow sort of political discontent in many ways. So the Russian army is completely falling apart. And so if we move on to the next point, when in October, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks become the government, the Soviets become the government, they're now then handed an even yet worse situation in terms of World War One. It's even worse. Just a terrible thing. And what they decide to do, Lenin decides to send Trotsky to negotiate a peace. It's the Bolshevik policy to have peace. I mean, as I say, that almost cliched line that Lenin promised peace, land, and bread. They were his three great promises to the people, to the proletariat. And peace is the first one. So Lenin's policy was to get peace at almost any price. And the one they came to is the Treaty of Brest Littoffs. And it's a really, really bad deal for the Russians. Really bad.
Can you say a bit more about that then? What does it involve?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's so bad that it led to the Civil War. I've heard historians say that once the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, it was inevitable that the Bolsheviks would have to have a civil war with all their enemies, because it's so bad, it's so humiliating. What it meant was basically Russia, or now the USSR, I don't think you can actually technically call it the USSR yet. But anyway, Lenin's government basically gave up hundreds of years worth of gains. So they gave up like Poland, Finland, loads of the Baltic states, nearly all of the Ukraine, massive chunks of Belarus, the Crimea, multiple wars over multiple generations just for that. Gave up little bits of Russia, ancient Russia proper, like areas around the Don River. Okay, it was like something like a third of Imperial Russia's population was just handed over to the Germans. So it's a massive thing. Sorry, go on.
I'll ask a silly question. Sorry for the naive question, but what happens to the citizens who were actually in these lands? They're considered under occupation then, or they're no longer Russian citizens? Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, well, no, that's right. It's at a stroke of a pen. They're now under the domain of the Kaiser rather than the Tsar, or rather than the Lenin's new provisional government. Yeah, a stroke of a pen. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Of course, it didn't last long because it was only a year or more, slightly more than a year, before the Germans themselves were completely defeated, and the map would have to be rewritten again. So, yeah, the story of that part of Eastern Europe in the 20th century is just such a harrowing, sad tale of a back and forth of just almost like an endless waves of catastrophe pouring over them. Yeah, it's really, really bad.
It's interesting to me that peace is the sort of primary goal, because it doesn't seem to take long until the civil war also erupts between the Bolsheviks and the counter-revolutionaries, the whites, so to speak. So obviously, peace was not necessarily considered prominent or to be a priority in the face of counter-revolution. They were actually quite, would you say, quite violent and aggressive in response to the sort of the whites, they called them, is that right? Independence movements.
Yeah, so as I mentioned a minute ago, I've heard someone say, and I totally agree, that after the signing of this Treaty of Brest-Littoffs, which ended the war for Russia, it did put an end to the war. It meant that a civil war was inevitable because it was just that bad. It was that much of a seismic thing. And that war lasts until like 1922, before the Bolshevik faction, the Reds, the communists, by that point now, they called themselves the communists to sort of thoroughly distinguish themselves from Mensheviks and some of the other sort of quite similar socialist movements. So there's sort of the Red communists versus all sorts of enemies. There's got sort of some of the foreign powers sent armies. The English and the French and the Americans at least bankrolled some armies inside Russia during that period. But you've also got the Greens. There's sort of this Green faction was sort of neither monarchists or constitutionalists, and certainly not Bolshevik. So there's sort of the Greens, and then there's the Whites, which is sort of Octoberists and imperialists and monarchists and constitutionalists. But this sort of overarching umbrella of calling them the Whites or the White faction, that's sort of a really not very stable cover term, because it actually encompasses lots and lots of different factions, and they never were able to hold together well enough. And in fact, that was their ultimate problem. That was the thing which really, in the end, just with to talk sweepingly here, the thing that meant their destruction was that they were never able to really work together. And the Bolsheviks, for all their failings, were sort of a tight-knit group in terms of ideology, in terms of purpose and goals. So there was this years-long civil war, and you've got the Red armies basically versus everyone else, and Trotsky is the head of the Red armies for a lot of it, and for most of it. And it's a really, really bloody, brutal civil war that doesn't end until 22.
Well, I mentioned just before we came on, I mentioned to you briefly Alexander Kolchak, or Admiral Kolchak, who's always been quite interesting to me. Seems also a polar explorer, but a military leader. I think he was, commander of all Russian land and sea forces or some such. He seems to have had quite a big role in the kind of counter-revolution to communism. Do you know much about him or his?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, he was one of the main boys, wasn't he? One of the main faces. I think for a while. Well, I don't know a fantastic amount, but I know a bit. I mean, he was the international, pardon me, the international community didn't want to recognise the Bolsheviks for quite a long time. The same happened with Mao and the Chinese communists. For quite a while, the international community, or the UN as it was in Mao's time, sort of refused to recognise them for quite a while. But of course, we're talking much earlier, so it wasn't even the League of Nations yet, but or just starting. But yeah, the international community, I think, recognised him as some sort of government in exile. You can have all sorts of different arrangements go on, but I know he was certainly considered one of the leaders of the white movement of of the sort of constitutional monarchists, I suppose they were. But as I say, it was only really a very loosely knit coalition of quite disparate and really quite fragmented groups with all sorts of different ideas, and he was some sort of figurehead, but was never able to truly unite them in any sort of, not enough anyway, for them to be able to topple the Bolshevik regime.
So there are lots of questions, and I don't know if you're comfortable talking about it, but a lot of people are wondering. You mentioned that the Bolsheviks, or the Reds, if you like, have this quite close, tight-knit common aim. And a lot of the members of the provisional government seem to have been ethnically Jewish. Is that a common theme? Just a question that keeps coming up in chat. Would you say that is that the general consensus of historians, that, as Solzhenitsyn said, they weren't Russians, but they were Jewish Bolsheviks? Is that generally agreed upon in the historian world?
I'm going to look out for Susan's eye of Sauron pointing at us now. We're going to talk about.
I'm honestly curious. I was interested in what the historical sort of consensus is.
Well, I mean, just the simple documented fact of the matter is, I suppose you can say there were a fair few Jewish people at the top of the Bolshevik movement. I mean, Trotsky was famously Jewish. Leon Trotsky. I think Zinoviev was Jewish. Was it Kamenev?
Lev Bronstein
was Jewish. Sorry?
Yeah, Lev Bronstein. That's Trotsky's real name, is it right? Is that right? Bronstein?
I actually don't know. Probably, maybe. I think maybe Lenin was like a quarter Jewish or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. But it's funny, actually, because Stalin was fairly anti-Semitic. He would take the piss out of Trotsky for being Jewish. He'd say anti-Semitic things about Trotsky. So I think there is a stray, some sort of theme of Jewishness through the upper echelons of the Bolsheviks. It's sort of hard to deny it. It is there, it seems. But then, as I say, Stalin wasn't a fan. I think I'm pretty sure he had a plan right at the end of his life where he was putting into motion some plan or other to round up Jewish doctors, specifically Jewish doctors, for whatever reason, some weird paranoid reason he had. He was going to round up all the Jewish doctors and have them murdered or thrown in gulags or something. So,
quite a long list, isn't there? Well, I did think I would just ask, because I'm not actually sure, but it is a theme that people are curious about. But I'm never really sure how that correlates with, as you say, that there's also a lot of evidence that what you might call quote unquote anti-Semitic sentiment as well. So I don't really know. So okay, what else can we talk? Do you want to talk about the Fabrice Eggs? I have one more question, actually, just before we go on to that, because would you say, is there evidence? What's the evidence that the social conditions for, to use socialist language, the people, markedly improved? Would you say that actually? I appreciate that we're in the middle of the First World War here as well, But is there a notable improvement in the material conditions in terms of poverty and health, for the people of Russia under the provisional government as opposed to the Tsar? Is there much evidence of that?
Oh God, that's a massive
sweeping
question. I know. Yeah, it's difficult. It depends, doesn't it? I mean, so you're saying, was just the living conditions for sort of your average Russian peasant better under the Soviet system than under the Tsarist system? Is that what you're asking, do you think?
Well, how would you respond, I suppose, to people who would say it was, the best thing that they could have ever done was to topple the Tsar and, that sort of imperial capital to bring about the socialist revolution? I mean, is there a marked difference, would you say? Yeah, I suppose, like you've just put, in terms of poverty, in terms of health and well-being.
Yeah, well, I would say the socialist experiment was largely like a disgusting failure. Of course, well, all the deaths in the Holodomor, the collectivization of much of Ukraine and Belarus is obviously a disgusting crime. So their standard of living didn't go up under a socialist rule, did it? So no, anyone who's trying to make that argument, of course, it depends where you lived, doesn't it? If you didn't live in those regions that were directly affected by it, if you were a reindeer farmer up in Siberia, you might have barely known that there was a change of government over the decades. Who knows? But if there are people that are trying to argue that in general, as sort of some sort of average, the plight of the average Russian was better under communism.
I wanted to be I want to be fair, just because I knew there are some people in chat who are more of a revolutionary temperament. So I thought I would just put that to you. I mean, it's a tricky one for me to deny. It's a pretty ugly history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, Fabrice Eggs. Okay, so this sounds like a very decadent change, and I obviously, we're talking about now the material wealth of the family, but what I find what got me thinking about these eggs is that obviously they're very beautiful, gorgeously crafted, and really notorious the world over. Everyone knows about Fabergé, but I guess because they're part of like a kind of Russia's cultural inheritance, in a way, they sort of belong to Russia as the nation, as opposed to necessarily just the family. And what got me thinking about this is there's an antiques dealer called Alexander Ivanov, and he's a massive billionaire. Obviously, he can afford to do this, but he sort of made his life commitment to. I was reading something on him the other day, and he's committed to bringing as much as he can back to Russia because he sees it as a kind of mark of dignity. And he said he felt embarrassed for Russia that, all these marks of a former height of power and empire were, maybe with a dealer in Hong Kong or China or whatever. And I thought that was quite an interesting commentary on the way in which a nation and dignity, even after 100 years, there's this kind of desire to bring back, like, to the motherland, things that are sentimentally important, but of course very decadent and rich as well. Does that make sense? Kind of overdone that a bit, haven't I? That was a very pretentious way to put it.
No. Yeah, like those Fabergé eggs are sort of part of the Russian heritage, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I think most of them are in private hands right now. I think what's that guy, Forbes magazine, Malcolm Forbes? I think he owned like 12 of them. Forbes. I think there's only like 40 odd in the world, and he owned like 12 at one point at least.
Right.
And yeah, they're fantastic things, aren't they?
I think as well.
I think I think they stand as a sort of a physical remain, sort of an artifact, a physical thing you can point to that shows the decadence of the late Romanovs. Because they are fantastically bejeweled and golden and things, and they were just given as Easter presents. They're these bejeweled eggs that they would give to each other as an Easter present.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite decadent, isn't it? Really.
Wow.
Whilst a lot of your people might be starving or whatever, to be doing that, and so But yeah, I mean, they're a fantastic thing. I think one thing I would say about the Bolsheviks and the communists is that they didn't, like, you know, completely just, you know, like the Hermitage is still there and everything. They didn't actually burn down the Tsar's palaces and things. I think sort of the French revolutionaries, for example, were a lot more destructive, or the Chinese in the Maoist period were a lot more destructive, physically destructive, than the Russian Soviets. But yeah, I mean, the fact that they still survive is incredible.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I noted they, because I know that one of the things they immediately got to work doing was tearing down churches and melting down the bells of these churches, which is quite interesting. And it seems that they didn't necessarily, I don't know if you can destroy gems, or I guess you can't really destroy diamonds and things, can you? But they sold a lot of it off. So there's a lot of it floating around out there, that, and a bit of a black market, I guess. And some of it's lost still. And I always find it interesting how there's this kind of contemporary. I watched this documentary, and there are so many archivists the world over who make it like a full-time profession trying to hunt down these lost treasures. And I guess I wondered if there's something more to that psyche than just naked self-interest and riches. I don't know, but everybody is kind of enamored and sort of finds it curious. Maybe it's like just the idea of a lost treasure hunt is just kind of exciting for us. I'm not sure. But they're very decadent, yes.
Well, I just think there's people are interested in every single level of their own history. They might not particularly agree or like the period, but it's part of their heritage, you know. So, for example, there's periods in English history I'm more or less interested in, and yet there'll be someone out there that is fascinated by that one little period, and, you know, they'll go into it and research it endlessly. So, yeah, it's just, I don't think it's that surprising that even, you could even say, a big chunk of Russians are just fascinated by the Tsarist period. I mean, even if they don't agree with the autocracy of the Romanovs, you can still be fascinated by it. Like, so, for example, I'm really interested in the age of King John, but I think King John is a terrible figure, a terrible person. If he were alive today, you could easily describe him as a monster. But that doesn't matter. I'm fascinated in his life and times, you know. So it could be the same with the Russians. You might not necessarily love what they actually stood for, but yet still be fascinated in sort of the artifacts from their time.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's the artifacts and then the importance that seems to have for a lot of Russians. As I say, I mentioned this one fella. He sort of made it a life obsession to see them restored just to Mother Russia. I always thought that was quite charming, really. Or, as I say, he can afford to do so, but it was a kind of level of desire for a restored dignity after a century on. It's quite nice that that's not just these things don't disappear in memory as readily as I think a lot of us imagine they do, which always gives me hope for the UK. But yeah, I don't know. Was there anything else you had in mind you wanted to talk about, or
well, I don't know. I suppose
one of the only things I'm sure there are lots of things, but
sorry. Yeah, I just think maybe we didn't really talk too much about sort of the final moments, or really Nicholas's character, his personality. About we touched on it, about how weak he was, or how he needed to be more strong-willed. I mean, there's they say that he sort of abdicated in his own mind months, maybe 6 months before it actually happened, and that everyone lost confidence in him. He'd clearly lost confidence in himself. And there's sort of some letters, heartbreaking letters, or depends how you look at it, heartbreaking, but maybe just comical if you're not on their side, of Alex, his wife, saying, you know, stand up, start being a man, do it for me, do it for our son, do it for your family, do it for Russia.
Interesting.
And he's just like, yeah, no, okay, I'll try. Anyway, yours sincerely, Heartbroken Nicky, things like this.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, his psychology is, like I say, really interesting. He's sort of kind of a man out of time in many ways. He was like a loving, doting father, who was like really worried that his kids had got measles or stuff. He was more worried about that than how many divisions he'd lost in the war. Yeah, and just not the sort of figure. You know, she was saying to him, "I need you to be. We all need you to be like a Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible type person. We need you to start leading,
Wow.
for God's sake." And you know, and he's just like, yeah, he's like really weak. And so, as I said right at the beginning, I suppose he's sort of
almost.
he led them to that cellar in many ways by not doing things, at least, but with his, by omitting to do things that he really needed to. And so, yeah, I find him sort of a sympathetic character in some ways, although I don't really have that much sympathy for him, as I said, but just a sympathetic figure in the sense that, well, as you said at the beginning, do you think he deserves it? You know, that's harsh, I think. Feel sorry for him more than anything.
I guess was did they get what was coming to them rather than, you know, did they get what they deserved? I think there's a slight difference. But as you said, maybe by omission, by the things he omitted to do, really sort of led himself to the.
Well, I mean, I would agree just in general with, you know, leftists or whatever, that it is sickening to see, you know, of course, I'm not a leftist, but, you know, it's not wrong of them to be sickened by this grandiose opulence, this sort of endless wealth that this family and their attendants lived in. You know, that is gross. So
yes, of course, especially when you're in abject poverty.
I wouldn't do that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, but is the penalty for that sort of death? I mean, they could have just gone to exile somewhere, just lived as private citizens. They didn't need death. But I don't know. I mean, the anger you might have got if you lived through their tyranny. I mean, to some they're just simply tyrants. They're just so, yeah. It's difficult in 2020 in England in 2020 to give a proper view of it.
It is. I mean, were they actually murdered by other members of the Bolsheviks again, or were these sort of rogue vigilantes? I don't actually know who murdered them.
No, they were the Bolsheviks. Yeah. So, well, it gets complicated. It gets kind of murky and complicated. So, when the Tsar abdicated, he was sort of immediately under house arrest under the Kerensky government in a palace, in one of his palaces, and he was there for a while. And then a few months later, because that whole summer of 1917 was really lots was going on. There was like the July days. Was sort of just this period in St. Petersburg that was just sort of something approaching anarchy. And then there was the Kornilov affair, another famous thing in August, where there was just lots of political wranglings going on. And at some point they decided, this provisional government, who are socialists, you know, SRs, decided to move the Tsar and his family much further away, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, which is what they did. And that's where they moved to, you know, not as nice surroundings, but they and effectively kept under house arrest, you know, guarded at all times, and then they were moved again. Well, so as I say, there's just a sort of a messy period where different types of red factions wanted to control them. One's the Reds that controlled the region that they were in, and Siberia wanted control of them. Obviously, the central Bolsheviks back in St. Petersburg wanted to have complete control of them. And there was more factions as well vying for what was going on. But in the end, eventually, they fall into the hands of a red faction, which is taking orders directly from St. Petersburg. And it's those guys that do, in the end, they are the ones that lead them into that cellar in July 1918 and murder them all.
I don't know if this is a myth as well, but is the story of their death that they were set up for supposedly taking a family portrait, a photograph, and that's what led them downstairs? Is that correct?
Sorry, say that again. Were they?
Am I right in thinking that they were told they were going to have a family portrait taken, and that's when they were killed, or was it just is that a myth?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That they were told that's why you've got to go down. Well, I think they were told that we're moving you again. So, and then they were told to go in the cellar. And I think at the very last moment, they were told to sort of arrange themselves as though they were going to have a portrait. And then I think, because the exact details of it, are a little shaky, a little murky. But I think at the last minute they were told that they were going to be executed. The guy, the leader of the faction that was holding them, read out a little something, a small missive that said, you know, Nicholas Romanov, you've been found guilty of crimes against the people, or whatever it was, and then they were just shot. So it's all quite quick, all quite informal, really. Yeah, well, it's a political assassination. So yeah, and the Bolsheviks rounded up all the other remaining members. I think there's 18 Romanovs in general were in total were rounded up and all killed. One of the aunties was thrown alive, an old nun who had been. You remember the granddad that was blown up? His widow. He'd fairly recently remarried a very young girl, and she was still alive. She was an old lady in 1917 and 1918, and she'd been a nun for many years since her husband was blown to bits, and they threw her alive down a mine shaft, and she just sung hymns down there until she died a few hours later.
Really?
Sad. Kind of sad. Wow, yeah, and that was the end of the. That's the end of the Romanov line. They just took the bodies out and burned them a bit and thrown them in a. Yeah, it's all very dark.
I do remember one thing I read last week, which I did think was sort of a combination of sort of almost poetic, but the ultimate symbol of just pure decadence is that the girls were wearing these corsets, and actually they'd been stuffed with diamonds, both as a way of sort of protecting them in case there was an attempted assassination, but also to preserve these gems. And when they were shot, so the story goes, this account, this kind of cascade of diamonds started spilling out. I just, oh Lord, like that's quite an image, isn't it? What you make of that, I don't know, but
yeah, that is one of the stories that they're jewel encrusted or jewel lined corsets, and I think that's true because all the accounts agree on it. That there was, and I think there was a lot of them as well, like a kilo or more of diamonds and assorted other gems. Yeah, they had a lot on them.
Yeah, of course. So, what was I going to say? Oh, what about the Princess Anastasia? There's quite a cult around her. Obviously, it was a Disney film. I've not actually seen it, or not for years. Am I right in thinking she was missing from the final resting place or the grave they found later?
Yeah, there is some sort of confusion about that, or some sort of. But I think that's all been put to rest now. Because there was an old lady that all through the 20th century or the late 20th century claimed to be Anastasia Romanov.
That's right.
And I remember watching a documentary, I think in the 1990s on TV, of this little old lady claiming that she was. But I think it was shown, I think it was proven, completely with DNA or something, that she just wasn't. I might be wrong about that. I could be terribly wrong about that, and someone will say.
I'm sure you're right. It's but kind of because
there were where their final bodies or their remains were found. It's all a little bit messy. They were thrown down a mine shaft, and then I think they were exhumed very soon after, like a day or something after, and sort of half buried in some bog kind of nearby. And then they weren't really properly found and exhumed again until I think the 1990s or something. And even then, it was only sort of partial remains and stuff. And it's just it's pretty gross stuff. That's the story.
The report, even today, I don't think has been fully released, has it, on their assassination? I'm not sure why.
I don't know what from the sort of Russian archives. I think most of it has been. I don't know actually. There's probably loads that's still left to be released, but I thought we know most of the details now. I believe.
I'd imagine so by now. But I did read that, but I could be wrong. So shall I read out some of the questions that have been sent to you? Is that okay?
Sure, if you want. Sure.
Yeah. So I should have said, I didn't even say at the beginning, folks, that you can put your questions on entropy. Still a few minutes to do that. For some reason, it always says that I'm offline, but I can actually see them. So if you want to ask a question, there is still time to do so. You don't have to send money, though. You can it's just a good way for me to gather the questions because the chat moves too quickly. All right. So JD Solway says, thanks for the stream. DOA and History Bro, a fine way to spend a Sunday Arvo. F the Bolsheviks. Okay, thank you very much. So a few questions from Silence's Ledden. Have either of you seen the film Russian Art by Alexander Sokurov. And history, bro, what is your educational background? Also, do you think a higher education is worth pursuing, or is passion more important? So that's a couple of things for you, my dear. I haven't seen the film, no, have you?
I haven't seen that film, I'm afraid, so I couldn't comment.
I'll have to look it up though if you recommend it. Yeah.
So what was the question? My educational background? I've got an undergrad in ancient history and a master's in politics and government, political philosophy. That's it. A few A levels in history and classical civilizations and that. And what was the other question?
So the other question was, do you think a higher education is worth pursuing, or is passion more important?
Well, it depends. If you want the higher education qualification for a specific reason, there's a bit in Goodwill Hunting when he says, your entire education boils down to a library card. Your Harvard humanities education in history or something. I could get the exact same thing with just a library card. And of course, the modern equivalent of that is just having access to the internet, isn't it? Like you don't need a university lecturer in order for you to read Thucydides or Herodotus or something. You can just do it. But
it's one of those great joys of
But if people want to do that, it is good. I mean, I really, really enjoyed my time at uni. Really loved it. Really, sort of halcyon days in a way. To sort of, instead of working in an office in a cubicle, I could just read books that I found interesting. That was sort of nice. So yeah, it's not for everyone. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I wouldn't just condemn all higher education because the universities are lost or something, although that may be the case. I mean, it depends. When I went to uni, it was there wasn't too much of that. I mean, it was like in 2003 or whatever. But I really liked it. But you don't have to do it. You can just do the reading on your own. But it's up to everyone. It's up to everyone to choose their own path in life. If you want to be or to have a job where you need that qualification, then don't shy away from it just because you think like the entire academy is lost. I don't know. Who am I to give advice to anyone?
Brilliant. Okay, so that's the. Well, you're very qualified, and I think you're getting a lot of love in chat, so absolutely. Okay, so Michael Phillips, hello, sir, has asked, how did the communist group sideline the liberal/democratic groups during the revolution?
Sorry, you broke up ever so slightly for me there. Could you say that again?
That's okay. Yeah, so how did the communist groups sideline the liberal/democratic groups during the revolution?
Right. Well, I mean, they weren't particularly sidelined. They had a civil war.
Yeah, I think we talked about that with the Reds and the Whites. Is that sort of
so sort of liberal or any sort of less aggressive strain of socialism, or anything approaching sort of liberalism or constitutional liberalism. All of those had been ideologically opposed to the Bolsheviks since forever, since before the turn of the 20th century. So there's no question that they sort of would work together and then were sidelined by the Bolsheviks. Like the Bolsheviks elbowed them out of the nest at the last minute. No, they were always complete ideological enemies. So, I don't know if that answers it. I don't know if I've got the wrong end of the stick on that question.
No, that's a perfect answer. And okay, we have another one. So Red Pilled Pharmacist says, hello, sir. He says, I know Simon Sebag, Montefiore and Robert Massey write about the Romanovs. Are there any other authors you recommend for learning about this topic?
I don't know. Simon Montefiore is one of the very best. I read a big book of his, listened to a big chunk of the audio book of it. So he's, I think, considered one of the main gold standards on them. Who else talks about them? I can't think off the top of my head, but he's sort of the main one.
Colin earlier, was he quite good?
Well, he's got a podcast on it. He did a series called Blueprint for Armageddon, which is all about World War One. but the podcast that's all about 1917, he just gives a lot of time, a few hours, to sort of the Russian picture at that point. Talks all about Rasputin in detail and stuff.
Oh, I'll download that then. That sounds excellent. Gosh, he does so much, that guy, Dan Carlin. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. All right. Well, was there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
Oh no, I mean, I think we're approaching the 2-hour mark. I know Dangerfield's going to be on at 4, and you know, don't want to keep the scrubs waiting.
Yeah, we don't want to stream cut. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have you. I mean, obviously 2 hours, it goes by so quick, and thank you so much. Though you're so knowledgeable. You really was quite remarkable, and yeah, quite astounding how well read you are on this. And thank you, chat, for being so well behaved. I know that it's a lot of opinions. Some people are very pro, some people are, you know, very much of the revolutionary persuasion. So I enjoyed reading what you had to say. I admire all of your honest opinions on it. And I'm sorry we don't, you know, it's such a huge topic. But I really enjoyed that. That was good fun. In fact, I'm keen to go and maybe watch this Russian art film this evening. And whilst I make my tea, I might put on the Dan Carlin podcast. So I would just remind you.
Remember the Alan Rickman Rasputin film? That's a good one. If I seem to remember, I haven't seen it yet, but it was. I mean,
is it just called Rasputin?
I think it is. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Well, he's great anyway. That sounds right up my street. I might put that on later. And everyone, please please do subscribe to History Brokers. Actually, his channel is really, really good quality, and particularly, as I say, particular Stalin series. Although you've got quite a number of, so you've got one on Drake I really liked as well. Really, really cool.
Oh, thank you. So, I mean, a lot of people said they liked that Drake one. The guy I recorded that with, a good friend of mine, Dan Davis, he sort of leads that one, but that is a really good story. I mean, if you're English as well, I mean, it doesn't really have to be along those lines, but you know, it's one of the great English heroes kind of thing.
Absolutely. No, well, I mean, are you working on anything more to come? What's your next sort of focus?
Yeah, I've got a bunch sort of coming up in the pipeline. I recorded a conversation with Devon Tracy. Atheism is unstoppable.
No way.
So I got to make that into a video, sort of about 2 hours worth. But I've been really sort of super busy over Christmas and New Year with work, sort of my day job sort of thing. So, and you know, making a 2 hour video, 2 hours worth into one of my videos does take hours and hours and hours. And I recorded.
It does, but that would be so good because I really like his humor. He's great.
Yeah, he shoots from the hip, certainly. He's not a shrinking violet. I think it's a good conversation. I hope it is, anyway. And I recorded another one with Tim Davis, the fighter pilot. Chris Dangerfield spoke to him once, and I thought he was a really great guy. And I had a conversation with him all about sort of aviation history, and all about aeroplanes and dogfights and all that sort of things, and fast jets. So I think that's going to be a really good. Well, it is a really good conversation. So. Yeah, I've got definitely a few things.
Well, this is what I mean. You always have such quality people to talk to.
Mm. Yeah, I've been blessed.
Well, he was a great guest when I heard him speak. You have.
Sorry.
And Dan Carlin as well. You spoke to, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
Amazing. Oh, well, okay. So please do subscribe, people. Yeah, I mean, okay. I guess we'll have to start thinking about the next time we stream. I'm sure there'll be something coming up in the pipeline that we can cover. And maybe some sort of other revolution or whatnot. But yeah, so I'll say a very happy Sunday to you all. Thank you all for tuning in. That was really good fun. And I'll try and get the entropy sorted properly because I always have problems with it. Not so you can send me money, but just so you can ask questions easily on there. It's a bit of a pain, but never mind. Have a lovely Sunday, everyone. And don't forget to say your prayers. And I'll see you all later. Okay? Bye.